If believing in Jesus has ever felt like a struggle to you, then this is the most important episode that you can watch. We're going to talk about a father today in Mark chapter 9 who has to admit to Jesus that he's struggling to believe because of everything that's going wrong with his son. There's a lot in this, and you're not going to want to miss it. It will change the way you think about faith. Let's dive in. The hardest realities of faith to come to is that the moments where it is needed the most are going to be the moments where it's probably in the shortest supply. That's just the nature of having it tested. One of the other big lessons that we have to come to is that faith is not built in strength, it's built in humility. When you get to this second section of Mark chapter 9, after you have the transfiguration, we talked about that in Matthew 17, the significance of Jesus being transformed and showing himself to Peter, James, and John as the Son of God. And you come to the same account of the man who's brought his seriously demon-possessed son to the apostles. None of the disciples that are gathered there are able to do anything for this boy. They don't understand why they're not able to do what they've been able to do before. And at the same time, the crowd is becoming unruly. Now, Matthew reminds us that some of the scribes and the Pharisees were contributing to that unruliness. But at the center of this is a man who's come to Jesus, and it's really his faith that's being tested. Mark chapter 9, beginning of verse 14, it says, when they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some of the scribes arguing with them. And immediately, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, what are you discussing with them? And one of the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and he grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. And he answered them and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you, and how long shall I put up with you? First thing we really need to look at is whose unbelief is Jesus addressing. I mean, you've got the disciples, and it's very clear if you go over to Matthew 17, when all of this calms down, Jesus pulls them aside and said, look, the reason why you couldn't do this is because of the littleness of your faith. If you've got enough faith, you can say to a mountain, get up and move over there, and it's going to do it. What he is specifically telling them in Matthew's account is, look, you couldn't do this because your faith wasn't where it ought to be. But then you've got the lack of faith of the Father who specifically challenges Jesus saying, I told your disciples to cast it out and they could not do it. Now, you have an expectation on his part. That's not really belief, and nor is it really faith. He's coming with a challenge and an expectation and not really with any humility at all. This entire confrontation is being stirred up by the scribes. It's serving their ends, and it really challenges our notion of what it means to believe Jesus. That some people say that to believe Jesus means to believe that he exists. Some people say that to believe Jesus means to believe that he's able to do something, but there's a key element. There's something that's missing on the part of the Father, and I think I can help you see what it is by going over to the book of Hebrews. It says in verse 1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It's a big word. It's the stability. It's the security and the substance of things that we hope for. It's the conviction. Some of your translations might use the word evidence. It's the proof of things that we do not see. For by it the men of old gained approval. So then we have verse 3 says, by faith. Thinking about what it says, the assurance of things we hope for, it's the proof of things that we don't see. So by faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. We then talk about the faith of Abel, his righteous blood still testifying of his good gift. We talk about the faith of Enoch, who did not see death because God took him up because he had this testimony that he was pleasing to God. That's a real big problem for Calvinism, by the way. And then you have this verse, and this is the verse I want to focus on, verse 6. And it says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Faith has some action behind it, because faith is not just about the confidence that we place in Jesus. It's not just a hope that we have in Jesus. Faith fundamentally speaks to the trust that we have in Jesus, even while we don't yet see the deliverance. The father may have come to Jesus expecting him to heal his son. He might have even believed that Jesus could heal his son, but that expectation wouldn't really be faith because it wasn't going to be real in the father's mind until it was done. Now, I get there's a lot of complications here because you're dealing with a father and a son. What this unclean spirit was doing to the boy was absolutely unfathomable. But here's the thing. Here's the missing element. And it's not just action like it does require seeking, but here's the missing element that I was alluding to earlier. And that is humility. The humility to come to Jesus even when things are wrong, to keep trusting, to keep believing, to keep seeing what you can't see. Now, I want you to hold on to that. That's going to come back when we get to the fourth point, when we talk about how do we make this all practical. So I want you to sort of file that away. But the next thing that I want to show you, we've already read this, so I'm not going to put it back up on the screen. Jesus actually seems pretty angry about this. It says in verse 19 that he answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you, and how long shall I put up with you?" Now, what's interesting about this, when Jesus calls them an unbelieving generation, that's deep language. And Jesus is doing more than just saying he's angry about this. He's actually using some very Old Testament language here. It's going to change the way that you read this response. But to see it, I need to take you back a little bit. Now, I hope you're going to be able to see the sidebar. I've got the main chapter of Mark 9 over here, and I've got a sidebar over here in Numbers 14. But I want you to see this. So here it is again, verse 19. And he answered and said to them, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? And how long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." I want you to look at this section out of Numbers chapter 14. This is after the rebellion of the people, and Moses has pled for them, but he's going to pass a judgment on them that says that most of the people weren't going to enter Canaan. It says in verse 20 of Numbers 14, "So the Lord said, I have pardoned them according to your word, but indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely all the men who have seen my glory," think about what Jesus was just doing on the mountaintop, right? That Peter, James, and John saw the glory of Jesus. "Surely all men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it." So Jesus is using the same kind of language here that the Father does in Numbers 14. Jesus is rebuking their unbelief. He's not just saying, "Hey, it makes me mad." What he's saying is this entire generation, this entire race of people, exact same thing that God said to Moses, "How long am I going to have to strive with you? How long am I going to put up with you?" So that is the same kind of language. And what that means is that this generation, and not just the Father, not just the apostles who didn't have the faith to do what they needed to do, even though Jesus has rebuked them for having small faith at number of times, not just the Pharisees that are there, but all of them. They all represent a problem that they don't trust him. They don't trust God. They're not willing to see. Every time that they have the opportunity to show their faith, they choose to show something other than faith. And what's interesting about that is both Matthew and Mark have highlighted people who were outside of the nation of Israel, that they had highlighted Gentiles who had more faith than the people who are supposed to be looking for the Messiah. And so there's a lot more going on here than "I'm just upset with you." But I want you to see where else this language gets used. In Matthew chapter 4, beginning in verse 7, after the devil has tested Jesus responds with a quotation from Deuteronomy 6. It says in verse 16, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test, as you did with him at Massa." Massa is the events of Exodus 17 and 7, and that's the first time that the people grumbled against God. They grumbled because they didn't have any water to drink, and God had to purify some water for them. So rather than just being angry with them, what Jesus is telling everyone present, the apostles, this father, the scribes that are whipping the crowd up into a frenzy, that your unbelief is changing your relationship with God. It's hardening your heart. It's causing you to put him to the test. Now, why this is significant is because this thought takes up a huge section of the book of Hebrews. Now, this is a lot of extra value here. And I really, if I've earned it, I want you to hit that subscribe button because this is a lot of extra value that I'm putting in here beyond just giving you the highlights of Mark chapter 9. But looking at Hebrews chapter 3, beginning in verse 12, it says, "Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God." This is what keeps you from putting God to the test. "Encourage one another day after day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. While it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. For who provoked him when they heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And who did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So they were not able to enter because of unbelief." So what the Hebrew writer is saying there is that a hardened heart is an unbelieving heart. We're conditioned to think that unbelief is just not believing that Jesus is the Son of God. The Hebrew writer says unbelief is putting God to the test. It's doubting him. It's not being able to trust in the goodness of God and in the ability of God to deliver and give us what we've hoped for in the middle of difficulty, because the difficulty is bigger than God. That's why Jesus is using this language that sounds like, why are you putting God to the test? It's almost like he's asking the Father to acknowledge why unbelief was speaking. And the Father explains, it's often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. So he's going to appeal to Jesus's compassion here. But remember what Jesus is addressing. He's addressing the unbelieving heart that becomes the hardened heart that turns away from God because it's angry. And that all starts with doubting God in the middle of our need, going back over to the Hebrew. If faith is the assurance of things that we hope for and the evidence of things that we don't see, then doubting God in the middle of our need is the beginning of unbelief. Jesus catches that right away and he rebukes the Father. He basically says, look, I need something from you that's more than if. If you can, all things are possible to him who believes. That's our tie right there. Verse 24, immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe, help my unbelief. Now, what did I tell you was going to come up when we got to point 3? I said humility, that hidden ingredient in point number 1 was going to come back up. Do you see the humility here? The humility to say, I want to believe. I'm struggling to believe. Struggle with belief is part of the journey of our faith. Where I stumble is when I fail to acknowledge that I don't have the faith that I need to have. That's where this becomes the issue. The Father says, I do believe. I want to believe. Help my unbelief. So Jesus is not just the source of healing for Jesus becomes in this the source of his faith. And that is a big thought. That's a thought that we really have to come to terms with, that faith is not something that I grow within myself just because I know the word of God better. Faith is not something that I grow within myself because I'm doing a lot of evangelism. Faith is not something that I grow within myself because I've got good practices. Faith is something that grows because I stay close to Jesus, because I see that he is faithful. And that's really what the Father is saying when he says, help my unbelief. It's help me see how faithful you are. And that might not sound like humility, but it really is, because he's acknowledging that everything that Jesus said about him and everything that Jesus said about that generation and the hardness of their heart and putting God to the test, that Father is acknowledging it's absolutely true. Everything you said is true. Help my unbelief. While you're curing my son, cure my unbelief. So how do I put that into practice when my faith is small? I can't go visit Jesus at the bottom of a mountain. I can't go visit Jesus and have him do a miracle for me. When my faith is small, how do I go about connecting with Jesus in a meaningful way that encourages faith? Well, obviously there's Bible reading, there's prayer, but there's something that we saw over in Hebrews chapter 3 that really needs to come into this discussion if we're talking about curing unbelief, not falling into hard-heartedness, and it's beyond just daily Bible reading and prayer. I'm not dismissing those in any way, but there is something important, and it does have to do with the humility that we've already talked about. Let's go back to Hebrews 3 and see if you can see it. I'm going to highlight some different phrases this time, starting with what we see right at the beginning of verse 12. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. Second thing I want you to see, verse 13, encourage one another day after day, so long as it is called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Are you seeing it yet? Let me take you to another passage in Hebrews and see if it jumps out at you a little more clearly there. This time we're going to go over to Hebrews chapter 10. It says in verse 19, therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil that is his flesh, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, these are all things that we need to be increasing our faith in, right? Let's see what it says in verse 22. Let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. You see those three statements that he makes. So the first thing he says, let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith. Let us draw near to who? Let us draw near to Jesus? Yeah. Let us draw near to the Father, the holy place? Yeah. Let us draw near to one another? Yeah. Second thing, let us, again, you got a collective there, hold fast our confession of hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. So there is a mutual assurance of hope. I have hope in Jesus. I want you to have hope in Jesus. I have assurance that Jesus is going to, remember, faith is the assurance of things that we hope for. I have assurance that Jesus is going to return. I'm going to confess that to you. The third thing he says is let us, again, this is a collective work, consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. You cannot afford to underestimate community of the faithful in overcoming unbelief. You just can't. You cannot afford to do that. Hebrews chapter 11, you know, that great passage we call the Hall of Faith. Here's a faithful person. Here's Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then we're going to come back to Abraham again. And then we're going to talk about Moses. And you remember that chapter? What's the point of that chapter? You get down to Hebrews 12 and 1, and it says, for since we've been surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily entangles us, and run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of God. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Noah, David, Abel, Enoch, all of those people, they're part of the cloud of witnesses that surround you that are meant to encourage your faith. Jesus is the witness that's before you that's meant to encourage your faith. That your brethren are the witnesses that are present with you that are meant to encourage your faith. You cannot afford to underestimate the value of community and overcoming unbelief. The problem is we do one of two things. We either minimize what faith is and we say, well, faith is just believing. I believe Jesus exists, so I'm saved, I'm good, I've got faith. That's not the picture we see in Mark chapter 9 or Hebrews chapter 3 or Hebrews chapter 10 or Hebrews chapter 12. But the other thing that we do is we minimize the struggle. We're so afraid of having someone else figure out that we're struggling with unbelief that we don't talk about it. We don't admit it to one another. We don't get the help to fix our eyes on Jesus, to confidently come to him, believing that it's his desire for us to be victorious over these things. And really, The reason why we struggle with so much unbelief is that we don't cry out, help my unbelief. We just say, I believe. We've got to get to the point where we can confess that our belief, our faith is not enough. And then we need to use all of the tools that he's given us: prayer, Bible reading, being at work in his kingdom, brethren, all of those things that deepen our connection to him, that deepen our belief. Those will help with unbelief. Those will help in these struggles where we feel like putting a big if in front of what we're asking Jesus for. If you can do this, Jesus can do it. The question is, am I approaching him according to his will, believing that if it is within his will, that it will be done? Look, there's a lot more to Mark chapter 9 than what we covered today. I really wanted to focus on this one story, but I'm going to suggest you watch this video right over here on Matthew chapter 17. If you really want to grow your faith from these events, that's the next one you should watch. And I'm going to put a link to the whole playlist right over here of Daily Bible Insights. Going to be doing some more long form videos next week that are separate from the Daily Bible Insights. I've worked out a few of those, just got to get them filmed. And the podcast will be dropping tomorrow as well. So a lot to do, a lot to be looking forward to. But until I see you again, have a good day and God bless.